Dusty Gulch. The name itself tasted like grit and sun-baked earth. In 1888, it wasn't a place for the faint of heart. Buildings huddled together like frightened sheep, trying to escape the relentless wind that howled through the narrow streets. The saloon, the Rattlesnake's Kiss, was the biggest structure, its swinging doors always promising a temporary escape from reality, even if that escape came with a hangover and an empty pocket. Life in Dusty Gulch was a constant struggle. The gold rush had long since dried up, leaving behind only dreams and the stubborn few who refused to give up on the promise of riches. Farmers battled the arid land, coaxing meager crops from the unforgiving soil. Ranchers fought off rustlers and prayed for rain. Every day was a gamble, a roll of the dice against the harsh realities of the West. Superstition clung to the town like dust to a cowboy's boots. Folks believed in omens, curses, and the power of the unseen. A black cat crossing your path meant bad luck. A raven landing on your roof was a sign of death. And whispers of witchcraft were enough to send shivers down even the toughest spines. The church, a small, weathered building on the edge of town, offered some solace, but even religion couldn't completely quell the fear that simmered beneath the surface. Reverend Eli, a man worn thin by hardship, preached about faith and forgiveness, but his words often seemed to get lost in the wind, carried away by the same forces that plagued the town. Dusty Gulch was a pressure cooker of hardship and fear, a place where desperation could turn ordinary people into accusers, and where a single spark could ignite a wildfire of suspicion. And that spark was about to arrive in the form of a young woman named Sarah. The stagecoach rattled into Dusty Gulch, kicking up a cloud of red dust that momentarily obscured the already faded sign welcoming visitors. Most folks barely glanced at it. Stagecoaches were a rare sight these days. But when Sarah stepped down, all eyes turned. She was different, not just because she was new, but because of the way she carried herself. Her clothes, though simple, were clean and well-maintained, a stark contrast to the patched and worn garments of the townspeople. Her hair, the color of spun gold, was neatly braided, and her eyes, a startling shade of green, seemed to absorb the light. Sarah carried a small, leather-bound book and a carpet bag containing all her worldly possessions. She didn't look like a prospector, a rancher, or a dance hall girl. She looked educated, intrigued, out of place. Old Man Hemlock, who ran the general store and knew everyone's business, squinted at her from beneath his bushy eyebrows. "New in town, are you?" he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice clear and melodic like a mountain stream. "My name is Sarah, and I'm looking for work." Work? That was a laugh. There wasn't much work to be found in Dusty Gulch these days, unless you counted struggling to survive as a job. But Sarah's hopeful gaze didn't waver. She seemed determined to make a place for herself, despite the odds. Word spread quickly about the new girl. Some were curious, others suspicious. Martha, the baker's wife, thought she seemed like a nice young woman. Jedediah, the blacksmith, just grunted and went back to hammering iron. But others, like Agnes, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper judgments, saw something unsettling in Sarah's unusual appearance and quiet confidence. "She's not like us," Agnes muttered to her neighbor. "There's something strange about her." And in a town like Dusty Gulch, strange was often the first step towards dangerous. The misfortune started subtly, almost unnoticed at first. Farmer Giles' prize bull, Big Bess, suddenly dropped dead in the pasture. Then, Mrs. Abernathy's chickens stopped laying eggs. These were unsettling events, but easily dismissed as bad luck, the kind that plagued Dusty Gulch from time to time. But then the well went dry. The town's only source of fresh water, usually reliable even in the driest months, simply stopped producing. Buckets came up empty, coated only with a thin layer of mud. Panic began to set in. Water was life in Dusty Gulch, and without it they were doomed. The whispers started then, low and insidious, like a snake slithering through the tall grass. "Something's not right," folks muttered, casting worried glances at the parched earth. "This ain't just bad luck." And then, young Timmy Abernathy, Mrs. Abernathy's son, fell ill. He developed a fever and started babbling incoherently, claiming he saw shadows dancing in his room at night. The doctor, a weary man named Doc Fuller, did what he could, but Timmy only seemed to get worse. Fear turned into desperation, and desperation into accusation. Agnes, always quick to point a finger, was the first to voice the unspoken thought that was festering in everyone's minds. "It's her," she hissed, her eyes narrowed. "It's that new girl, Sarah. She brought this on us." The other townspeople, already on edge, were quick to agree. Sarah was different, strange, and misfortune had arrived with her. It was too much of a coincidence. They needed someone to blame, someone to hold responsible for their suffering. And Sarah, the outsider, was the perfect scapegoat. The seed of suspicion had been planted, and it was about to bloom into a full-blown frenzy. The bad luck that struck Dusty Gulch was about to get a whole lot worse for Sarah. The whispers grew louder, bolder, transforming into open accusations. Agnes, fueled by fear and a long-held resentment for anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of normal, became the self-appointed leader of the anti-Sarah movement. She gathered a group of like-minded women, their faces etched with worry and suspicion, and they began to spread rumors and half-truths about Sarah's supposed powers. They claimed she was seen muttering strange incantations under the moonlight. They said she had a familiar, a black cat that followed her everywhere, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They whispered about her book, the leather-bound volume she always carried, claiming it was a book of spells and dark magic. The men, initially hesitant, were eventually swayed by the women's fervor. They were desperate for a solution, any solution, to the town's problems. And the idea that Sarah was responsible, that they could eliminate the source of their suffering, became increasingly appealing. Sheriff Brody, a man who had always prided himself on being fair and just found himself caught in the middle. He knew that accusing someone of witchcraft was a serious matter, requiring proof, not just suspicion. But he also saw the fear in the eyes of his neighbors, the desperation that threatened to tear the town apart. He tried to reason with them, to urge them to wait for evidence, but his words fell on deaf ears. The pressure mounted, fueled by Agnes's relentless campaign and the town's growing panic. Sheriff Brody knew he couldn't ignore the accusations any longer. He had to do something, even if it meant going against his own better judgment. He issued a warrant for Sarah's arrest. The whispers of witchcraft had become a roar, and Sarah was about to be swept away by the tide of fear and prejudice. The trial was a mockery of justice. Held in the town square, under the scorching sun, it was more of a public spectacle than a genuine attempt to uncover the truth. Sheriff Brody, his face etched with guilt and resignation, presided over the proceedings, but his authority was undermined by the mob mentality that gripped the town. Agnes served as the chief accuser, her voice shrill and filled with righteous indignation. She presented no real evidence, only rumors and conjecture, painting Sarah as a malevolent force that had brought ruin upon Dusty Gulch. Other townspeople, eager to join the chorus of condemnation, testified about Sarah's strange behavior, twisting innocent actions into sinister plots. Sarah, standing before the crowd, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief, tried to defend herself. She explained that her book was a collection of poetry and scientific observations, not a book of spells. She denied ever practicing witchcraft or casting curses. She pleaded with them to see reason, to remember the values of fairness and compassion. But her words were drowned out by the jeers and shouts of the crowd. They were not interested in the truth. They wanted a scapegoat, someone to blame for their misfortunes. The jury, composed of 6 hastily chosen townsmen, barely listened to Sarah's defense. Their minds were already made up. The verdict was swift and predictable, guilty. The crowd erupted in cheers, their faces flushed with triumph. Sarah was condemned to be hanged. Sheriff Brody, his heart heavy with regret, pronounced the sentence, knowing that he had failed to protect an innocent woman from the wrath of a frightened and misguided town. The sun seemed to dim as the reality of the injustice settled over Dusty Gulch. Jebediah, the town's hangman, was a man of few words and a somber demeanor. He was a large man, built like an oak, with hands calloused from years of working with wood and rope. His face was weathered and lined, a roadmap of a life lived under the harsh western sun. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was a practical one. Death was a part of life, especially in a place like Dusty Gulch, and someone had to do the unpleasant jobs. He had carried out his duties efficiently and without complaint for years, hanging outlaws, murderers, and horse thieves. He saw it as a necessary service, a way to maintain order in a lawless land. He never questioned the justice of the sentences. That was the sheriff's job, the judge's job, the jury's job. His job was simply to carry out the verdict. But this time was different. He had watched the trial, listened to the accusations, and witnessed the town's descent into madness. He had seen the fear in Sarah's eyes, heard the desperation in her voice, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He knew Sarah wasn't an outlaw or a murderer. She was just different. And in Dusty Gulch, different was a crime punishable by death. He tried to push the doubts aside, to tell himself that he was just doing his job. But the image of Sarah's face, her green eyes wide with fear, haunted him. As he prepared the gallows, the familiar routine felt different, heavier. The ropes seemed to weigh more. The wood felt rougher against his skin. He knew that tomorrow he would be taking a life, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could do it. The weight of Dusty Gulch's judgment rested heavily on his broad shoulders. In the days leading up to the execution, Jebediah found himself drawn to the jail cell where Sarah was being held. He didn't speak to her at first, just observed her from a distance. He watched her read her book, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw her offer a kind word to the jailer, a young man named Billy, who seemed to be the only person in town who hadn't succumbed to the hysteria. He noticed the way Sarah treated her black cat, Midnight, which Billy had allowed to stay with her. She spoke to the cat in soft, soothing tones, stroking its fur with gentle hands. There was no malice in her, no hint of the dark magic the townspeople accused her of. One evening, Jebediah brought Sarah a plate of food from the saloon. It was the best he could offer, greasy and unappetizing, but it was better than the meager rations she had been receiving. He slid the plate under the bars of her cell, avoiding her gaze. "Thank you," Sarah said softly. "That's very kind of you." Jebediah grunted in response and turned to leave. But then Sarah spoke again. "Mr. Jebediah?" He stopped and turned back, his face unreadable. "Do you believe I'm a witch?" she asked, her green eyes searching his. Jebediah hesitated. He didn't know what to say. He didn't believe it, not really. But he also didn't know how to explain the town's madness, the fear that had consumed them all. "I just do what I'm told," he mumbled, turning away again. But Sarah's question lingered in the air, a seed of doubt planted in his already troubled mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to make a terrible mistake. He saw her kindness, her humanity, and it chipped away at the wall he had built around his heart, the wall that allowed him to carry out his grim duty without question. The night before the hanging, Jebediah tossed and turned in his small, Spartan cabin on the outskirts of town. Sleep eluded him. The image of Sarah's face, her green eyes pleading, was burned into his mind. He kept replaying the trial in his head, searching for some piece of evidence, some justification for the verdict, but he found nothing but fear and prejudice. He finally drifted off to sleep, but his rest was troubled by a vivid dream. He saw Sarah standing in the town square, surrounded by flames. The townspeople were chanting and pointing, their faces contorted with hatred. But then, the flames parted, revealing a hidden spring, gushing with clear, fresh water. Sarah reached out and offered the water to the thirsty townspeople, but they recoiled in fear, refusing to accept her gift. He awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. The dream was so real, so symbolic. He interpreted it as a sign, a warning. Sarah was not a bringer of misfortune. She was a source of life, a potential savior. The town was blinded by fear, refusing to see the truth. He got out of bed and walked outside, the cool night air washing over him. He looked up at the stars, searching for guidance. He had always believed in fate, in the idea that everything happened for a reason. But now, he wondered if fate was something that was predetermined or something that you could choose. He thought about his own life, his own choices. He had always followed orders, done what was expected of him. But what if doing what was expected was wrong? What if his duty was not to carry out the verdict, but to prevent an injustice? The dream had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront the doubts that had been gnawing at him for days. He knew what he had to do. He had to find a way to save Sarah, even if it meant defying the entire town. The day of the hanging dawned bleak and gray, mirroring the mood that had settled over Dusty Gulch. A large crowd had gathered in the town square, their faces a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The gallows stood stark against the horizon, a grim reminder of the fate that awaited Sarah. Sheriff Brody, his shoulders slumped with defeat, escorted Sarah from the jail cell. She walked with her head held high, her green eyes scanning the crowd, searching for a flicker of understanding or compassion. But she found only cold stares and hardened hearts. Midnight, her black cat, was nowhere to be seen. Billy had taken him away, fearing for his safety. Jebediah stood on the platform, his face a mask of grim determination. He had spent the entire night wrestling with his conscience, steeling himself for the decision he had made. He knew that defying the town would have consequences, but he couldn't stand by and allow an innocent woman to die. He watched as Sarah was led onto the platform, her hands bound behind her back. She was dressed in a simple white dress, which seemed to accentuate her vulnerability. Reverend Eli offered her a final prayer, but Sarah barely seemed to hear him. Her gaze was fixed on Jebediah, her eyes filled with a silent plea. The noose was placed around her neck, the rough rope chafing against her skin. Jebediah felt a surge of nausea, a wave of guilt threatening to overwhelm him. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of his neighbors, his friends. He saw Agnes, her eyes gleaming with triumph. He saw Sheriff Brody, his face etched with shame, and he knew that he couldn't go through with it. He had to do something, anything, to stop this madness. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the rustling of the wind. The moment of truth had arrived. Just as Sheriff Brody was about to give the signal, Jebediah stepped forward, his voice booming across the silent square. "I can't do it." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, shattering the tense silence. The crowd gasped, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Agnes let out a shriek of outrage. Sheriff Brody stared at Jebediah, his mouth agape. "What are you saying, Jebediah?" Sheriff Brody finally managed to stammer, his voice barely audible above the murmuring of the crowd. "I can't hang her," Jebediah repeated, his voice firm and unwavering. "She's innocent." "Innocent," Agnes screeched, her face contorted with fury. "She's a witch. She brought this curse upon us." "There's no curse," Jebediah retorted, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "There's only fear and ignorance. We're about to kill an innocent woman based on nothing but rumors and superstition." "He's bewitched," someone shouted from the crowd. "She's put a spell on him." "He's gone mad," another voice cried out. The crowd began to surge forward, their anger reaching a fever pitch. Sheriff Brody, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, stepped in front of Jebediah, his hand resting on his gun. "Stand back," he shouted, his voice regaining some of its authority. "Everyone calm down. This is still my town, and I won't allow any violence." But the crowd was in no mood to listen to reason. They had come to see justice served, and they weren't about to let Jebediah stand in their way. The town square was about to erupt into chaos. Jebediah's act of defiance had unleashed a torrent of anger and resentment that threatened to tear Dusty Gulch apart. And Sarah, still standing on the gallows with the noose around her neck, was caught in the middle of it all. "He's gone soft," Agnes screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "He's betrayed us. Get him." The crowd surged forward, breaking through Sheriff Brody's attempt to maintain order. They were a mob now, driven by fear and righteous anger. Jebediah stood his ground, his large frame a bulwark against their fury. But he knew he couldn't hold them back forever. Sheriff Brody, seeing the situation was about to explode, made a split-second decision. He pulled out his gun and fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed through the square, momentarily silencing the crowd. "I said, stand back," he roared, his voice amplified by the sudden silence. "I'm still the law in this town, and I won't let this turn into a lynching." He turned to Jebediah. "Jebediah, get Sarah out of here. Now, I'll hold them off as long as I can." Jebediah didn't hesitate. He quickly untied Sarah's hands and removed the noose from her neck. He led her off the platform, shielding her from the angry stares of the crowd. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We're getting out of Dusty Gulch," Jebediah replied grimly. "It's not safe for you here anymore." He knew they couldn't stay in town, not with the mob baying for their blood. They had to escape, to find a place where Sarah could be safe from the prejudice and superstition that had consumed Dusty Gulch. But escaping wouldn't be easy. The townspeople wouldn't let them go without a fight. And even if they managed to escape, they would be outlaws, fugitives from justice. Jebediah had made his choice, and he was prepared to face the consequences. He had saved Sarah's life, but he had also put his own life in danger. He had defied Dusty Gulch, and now he would have to pay the price. They ran. Jebediah, leading Sarah by the hand, raced through the narrow streets of Dusty Gulch, the angry shouts of the mob echoing behind them. Sheriff Brody did his best to hold them back, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they broke free. They reached the edge of town, where Jebediah had stashed a couple of horses. He helped Sarah mount one, then swung himself onto the other. They spurred their horses forward, galloping away from Dusty Gulch as fast as they could. Behind them, the mob surged out of town, their faces contorted with rage. They were armed with guns, pitchforks, and anything else they could find. They were determined to catch Jebediah and Sarah and bring them back to face justice, or rather, their twisted version of it. As they rode, Jebediah knew they couldn't outrun the mob forever. They needed to find a place to hide, a place where they could regroup and plan their next move. He remembered an old abandoned mine shaft a few miles outside of town, a place he had used as a hideout as a boy. It was their only chance. They reached the mine shaft just as the mob crested the hill behind them. They dismounted and scrambled down the steep embankment, disappearing into the darkness of the mine. The mob hesitated at the entrance, their fear of the unknown momentarily outweighing their desire for revenge. But Agnes, her eyes blazing with fanaticism, urged them forward. "They can't hide in there forever," she shrieked. "We'll smoke them out. We'll burn them out. We'll make them pay for their sins." Jebediah and Sarah were trapped, hunted by a mob of angry townspeople, with no hope of escape. Their only chance was to find a way to prove Sarah's innocence, to expose the truth behind the misfortunes that had plagued Dusty Gulch. But finding the truth wouldn't be easy, especially with the entire town against them. The odds were stacked against them, but Jebediah was determined not to give up. He had saved Sarah from the gallows, and he would do everything in his power to keep her safe. Inside the mine shaft, the darkness was absolute. Jebediah fumbled for his matches and lit a small lantern, casting a dim circle of light around them. The air was thick with dust and the smell of damp earth. The mine was unstable, the wooden supports rotting and creaking ominously. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "This place is dangerous." "I know," Jebediah replied, "but it's the only place we have for now. We need to figure out what to do next." He knew they couldn't simply wait for the mob to find them. They had to take action, to find a way to clear Sarah's name and expose the real cause of the town's misfortunes. He thought back to the events that had led to Sarah's accusation, the dead bull, the dry well, Timmy Abernathy's illness. There had to be a logical explanation, something that didn't involve witchcraft. "Do you remember anything unusual happening before all this started?" he asked Sarah. "Anything that might give us a clue?" Sarah thought for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There was that strange dust storm a few weeks ago," she said. "The wind was blowing from the north, and the air was filled with a reddish dust. It coated everything." Jebediah's eyes lit up. "The north?" That's where Old Man Hemlock's copper mine is located. I heard he was using some new blasting techniques. He suddenly had a theory. What if the blasting had released some kind of toxic substance into the water supply, poisoning the well and causing the other misfortunes? It was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. "We need to get to Hemlock's mine," Jebediah said. "We need to see what's going on there." But getting to the mine wouldn't be easy. The mob was still outside, waiting for them. And even if they managed to escape, they would have to face the wrath of Old Man Hemlock, a powerful and ruthless man who wouldn't hesitate to protect his interests. But Jebediah was determined to find the truth, no matter the cost. He had made a promise to Sarah, and he wouldn't let her down. Under the cover of darkness, Jebediah and Sarah slipped out of the mine shaft, leaving the still vigilant mob behind. They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the main roads. They knew that every step they took was fraught with danger, that the townspeople were out there, searching for them. They reached Hemlock's mine just before dawn. The mine was a sprawling complex of tunnels and buildings, buzzing with activity. Workers were busy hauling or operating machinery and tending to the blast furnaces. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of chemicals. Jebediah and Sarah hid behind a cluster of rocks, observing the scene. They needed to find a way to get inside the mine, to gather evidence of the toxic substances that Jebediah suspected were poisoning the water supply. "I have an idea," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Remember my book? It's filled with drawings and diagrams of plants and minerals. I could pretend to be a geologist, inspecting the mine for new deposits." Jebediah hesitated. It was a risky plan, but it was their only chance. "All right," he said, "but be careful. Hemlock is a shrewd man. He won't be easily fooled." Sarah took a deep breath and walked confidently towards the mine entrance, her book clutched in her hand. Jebediah watched from a distance, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that Sarah was putting herself in grave danger, but he had faith in her. He had seen her intelligence, her courage, her unwavering determination. He knew that she was capable of anything. Sarah approached the guard at the gate and flashed a disarming smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and confident. "I'm here to conduct a geological survey of the mine. I have permission from the Mining Commission." The guard eyed her suspiciously. "I don't know anything about that," he said. "You'll have to speak to Mr. Hemlock." Sarah nodded and followed the guard inside the mine complex, disappearing into the maze of buildings and tunnels. Jebediah was left alone, waiting, wondering if he had just made a terrible mistake. Inside the mine, Sarah was led to Hemlock's office, a lavishly decorated room that stood in stark contrast to the harsh conditions of the mine itself. Hemlock, a portly man with a shrewd gaze and a handlebar mustache, greeted her with a suspicious smile. "So, you're from the Mining Commission?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. "I wasn't expecting anyone." "There must have been a miscommunication," Sarah replied, her voice calm and steady. "I'm here to assess the potential for new mineral deposits. Your recent blasting techniques have piqued our interest." Hemlock raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly are you hoping to find?" "Anything of value," Sarah said, glancing around the room. "But I'm particularly interested in the composition of the dust released by your blasts." Hemlock's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm sure everything is perfectly safe," he said, "but feel free to take a look around." He assigned a foreman to escort Sarah through the mine, but Sarah managed to slip away, using her knowledge of geology to navigate the complex tunnels. She collected samples of the dust, carefully sealing them in small vials. She also examined the water runoff from the mine, noting its unusual color and smell. As she was about to leave, she stumbled upon a hidden chamber where she found barrels filled with a strange, crystalline substance. The barrels were labeled with a warning: "Toxic waste. Handle with extreme caution." Sarah realized that this was it, the source of the town's misfortunes. Hemlock was illegally dumping toxic waste into the mine, which was leaching into the water supply and poisoning the town. She had to get this evidence back to Jebediah to prove Sarah's innocence and Hemlock's guilt. But as she turned to leave, she heard a voice behind her. looking for something. It was Hemlock, his face no longer smooth and smiling, but hard and menacing. He knew that Sarah had discovered his secret, and he wasn't about to let her leave with the evidence. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Hemlock," Jebediah's voice boomed from the shadows. Hemlock whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise. Jebediah stepped out of the darkness, his gun drawn and aimed at Hemlock's chest. "How did you get in here?" Hemlock demanded, his face turning red with anger. "That's not important," Jebediah replied, his voice cold and unwavering. "What is important is what you've been doing to this town." "I don't know what you're talking about," Hemlock blustered, but Jebediah could see the fear in his eyes. "The toxic waste," Jebediah said, nodding towards the barrels. "The poison water, the dead cattle, Timmy Abernathy's illness. It's all your fault." "Those are just accidents," Hemlock protested weakly. "Accidents that have nearly cost an innocent woman her life," Jebediah retorted. "You're going to pay for what you've done, Hemlock." He grabbed Sarah by the arm and led her out of the chamber, taking the samples and evidence with them. They made their way back to Dusty Gulch, determined to expose Hemlock's crimes and clear Sarah's name. When they arrived in town, they found the streets deserted. The townspeople were holed up in their homes, fearing what might happen next. Jebediah led Sarah to the town square and fired a shot into the air, summoning everyone to gather. Slowly, cautiously, the townspeople emerged from their homes, their faces etched with curiosity and apprehension. Agnes was among the first to arrive, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What do you want, Jebediah?" she demanded. "Have you come to gloat?" "I've come to tell you the truth," Jebediah replied, his voice ringing with conviction. "The truth about what's been happening to Dusty Gulch." He held up the vials of contaminated water and the sample of toxic waste. "This is the reason your cattle are dying," he said. "This is the reason your well went dry. This is the reason Timmy Abernathy is sick. Hemlock has been poisoning your town." A hush fell over the crowd as Jebediah spoke. They looked at the vials of contaminated water, then at each other, a dawning realization spreading across their faces. Doubts began to creep in, replacing the fear and anger that had consumed them. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his face grim. "Is this true, Jebediah?" he asked. "Can you prove it?" "I can," Jebediah replied. "Sarah found barrels of toxic waste hidden in Hemlock's mine. She took samples. We can test them, compare them to the water in the well. We can prove that Hemlock is responsible for all of this." Sheriff Brody nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." He turned to the crowd. "I'm going to need some volunteers," he said. "We're going to Hemlock's mine to investigate." A few brave souls stepped forward, their faces determined. Even Agnes, her eyes filled with remorse, joined the group. They marched towards Hemlock's mine, their initial anger now directed at the man who had betrayed their trust and endangered their lives. At the mine, they found the evidence Jebediah had described. The hidden chamber, the barrels of toxic waste, the contaminated water runoff. The evidence was undeniable. The townspeople returned to Dusty Gulch, their faces filled with shame and regret. They had been so quick to judge, so eager to find a scapegoat. They had allowed fear and superstition to cloud their judgment, leading them to condemn an innocent woman. They gathered in the town square, their heads bowed in shame. Agnes stepped forward, her voice trembling. "We were wrong," she said. "We let our fear get the better of us. We accused Sarah of witchcraft, but she was innocent. We owe her an apology." One by one, the townspeople echoed Agnes's words, expressing their remorse and admitting their mistake. They had almost committed a terrible injustice, and they were deeply ashamed of their actions. The realization of their error hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the importance of seeking the truth. Sheriff Brody placed Hemlock under arrest, charging him with poisoning the town's water supply and endangering the lives of its citizens. The townspeople, their anger now fully directed at Hemlock, watched as he was led away, his face a mask of defeat. Then, they turned their attention to Sarah, who stood beside Jebediah, her green eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Agnes stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "Sarah," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "We were wrong about you. Terribly wrong. Can you ever forgive us?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then took Agnes's hand. "I forgive you," she said softly. "But please learn from this. Don't let fear and prejudice cloud your judgment again." One by one, the townspeople approached Sarah, offering their apologies and expressing their gratitude for her courage and her willingness to forgive them. They realized that she was not a witch, but a kind and intelligent woman who had only wanted to help their town. The town council officially exonerated Sarah, clearing her name and restoring her reputation. They also offered her a position as the town's new schoolteacher, recognizing her intelligence and her passion for knowledge. Sarah accepted the position, determined to use her knowledge to educate the children of Dusty Gulch and help them avoid the mistakes of their parents. She knew that healing the town would take time, but she was willing to stay and help them rebuild, to create a community based on trust, understanding, and respect. The well was cleaned, the water tested, and the town slowly began to recover from the effects of the poisoning. Timmy Abernathy, thanks to Sarah's knowledge of herbal remedies, began to recover from his illness. Dusty Gulch had learned a hard lesson about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of seeking the truth. And Sarah, the woman they had almost hanged, had become their unlikely savior. Jebediah, who had stood silently by Sarah's side during the apologies, found himself the focus of the town's attention as well. Sheriff Brody stepped forward and clapped him on the shoulder. "Jebediah," he said, "we owe you an apology too. We were so blinded by fear that we didn't see the truth. You were the only one brave enough to stand up and do what was right. You saved Sarah's life, and you saved this town." The townspeople echoed Sheriff Brody's sentiments, expressing their gratitude for Jebediah's courage and his unwavering commitment to justice. They realized that he had risked everything to save Sarah, knowing that he would face their wrath if he failed. Jebediah, a man of few words, simply nodded in response. He didn't need their praise or their gratitude. He had done what he believed was right, and that was all that mattered. As the days passed, Sarah began to settle into her new role as the town schoolteacher. She transformed the small, dilapidated schoolhouse into a vibrant center of learning, filling it with books, maps, and scientific instruments. She taught the children about reading, writing, arithmetic, and the wonders of the natural world. She also taught them about the importance of critical thinking, of questioning assumptions, and of seeking the truth, even when it was difficult or unpopular. She wanted to instill in them a sense of curiosity, a love of learning, and a commitment to justice. Sarah still carried the scars of her ordeal, the memories of the trial, the gallows, and the angry faces of the townspeople. But with each passing day, she felt herself healing, her fear fading with each passing day. Dusty Gulch was never quite the same after that. The townspeople had learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of seeking the truth. They became more tolerant, more understanding, and more willing to accept those who were different from them. They also learned to be more skeptical of rumors and superstition, relying instead on facts and evidence. They realized that fear could cloud their judgment and lead them to make terrible mistakes. The town council passed new laws to protect the environment and prevent future incidents of pollution. They also established a system of checks and balances to ensure that no one person could wield too much power. Sheriff Brody, haunted by his role in Sarah's unjust trial, became a staunch advocate for justice and fairness. He worked tirelessly to protect the rights of all citizens, regardless of their race, religion, or social status. Agnes, humbled by her mistake, dedicated herself to helping others. She volunteered at the schoolhouse, assisting Sarah with her teaching. She also became a vocal advocate for tolerance and understanding, using her experience to educate others about the dangers of prejudice. Dusty Gulch had transformed from a town ruled by fear and superstition into a community based on trust, understanding, and respect. It was a slow and difficult process, but they had learned from their mistakes and emerged stronger and wiser. The scars of the past would always remain, but they served as a constant reminder of the importance of justice, fairness, and compassion. Dusty Gulch had finally found a new beginning, and it had all started with a hangman who changed his mind. But what of Sarah and Jebediah? Their lives were forever intertwined, bound by the events that had transpired in Dusty Gulch. Jebediah, no longer the town hangman, found a new purpose in helping Sarah at the schoolhouse. He used his woodworking skills to build desks and bookshelves, and he often sat in on Sarah's lessons, listening intently to her teachings. He found himself drawn to her intelligence, her compassion, and her unwavering spirit. He admired her ability to forgive, to heal, and to inspire others. He had saved her life, but she had also saved him, giving him a new sense of purpose and a new reason to believe in himself. Sarah, in turn, appreciated Jebediah's quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty, and his newfound commitment to justice. She saw beneath his gruff exterior, recognizing the kind and gentle soul that lay hidden within. She knew that he had risked everything to save her, and she would never forget his courage and his sacrifice. They spent their days working together at the schoolhouse, teaching the children of Dusty Gulch about the importance of knowledge, tolerance, and understanding. They shared their evenings reading books, discussing ideas, and simply enjoying each other's company. One evening, as the sun set over Dusty Gulch, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jebediah and Sarah sat on the porch of the schoolhouse, watching the children play. "Thank you, Jebediah," Sarah said softly, her green eyes